Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. I'd be very happy to have you. It's the truth be told, you'd be the yeah. Danny Matt's amazing. Yeah, that's an impressive. He's an impressive person. Yeah. My mom used to run the spirituality center, the JCC in New York, and they have this day of Kabbalah there every year. So one of her big things of her job for many years was putting it together. Right. Right. But well, so you know what? Apropos that you're at the right service tonight, as a matter of fact, I'll explain why in a second. I just got to go run and get my own. I'll be ready. That's very good. I feel much better about the course of things tonight. Hello, Celia. How you doing? Which one? Well, no, but well, so this is the eternal sort of running joke of Judaism, right? Is that it all depends on where you start the conversation, right? So Mimi comes from a classical reform background, right? So classical reform, a lot of these things are very different, and when it gets changed up from week to week, it can be challenging. Just apropos of what Barry here was saying, right, is that for those of us that grew up learning how to, daven, there wasn't a whole lot of variation necessarily. You knew exactly when to say things, when not to say things, when to mumble, when to stand, when to sit. So the idea of a sort of constantly changing music is not as new a thing as you might think, but it can feel that way. So whatever our melodies were like when I first got here, each one of our cantors has subtly changed things over the years. So I have to actually go back in my memory to try to remember how things were before a certain cantor, etc. Well, I think you're the real tunes. Look, all I can tell you is that at this point, the way my brain works is that it's pattern based. So if you mess with the pattern, it messes the whole thing up. So if, like, when I'm leading services tonight by myself, I have to remember the pattern differently than what it is when Lauren is here, which was different than when Jordan was here, which was different than. So it's interesting. And for them, they can all read music, right? So if they want to change the music, all they have to do is, well, it's not all they have to do, but they can find the music, the musical notes, and they can remember it. Me, I have to do it solely from memory. Everything is solely from memory. No. But there's a lot of crossover melodies, actually. Once you have a sort of, the Debbie Friedman movement that sort of takes place in a lot of cases, you get a lot more similar kinds of music for certain kinds of things. From the other night, I thought, I got at least a couple of laughs for, I thought my sponsorship thing was my most brilliant move, though. I thought it was funny. I just thought it was good. Well, I jokingly said that the evening in Purim was sponsored, and so to just rib Neil and Howard, so I said one of the sponsors was Schwatzky's Shushan Shlivovitz, and I said the tagline was "Tastes like hell but feels like heaven," and then I think I called it Famous Fagan's Collection Agency, and I said if you haven't paid your dues, he's coming after yous. And I don't know what it was. At some point in the middle of the day, I had this, idea, and this was for Purim on what was it, Wednesday night. Yeah, well, I was attempting a one-man sort of equivalent of a spiel. I don't think it necessarily carried that kind of weight, but we had a good time. I thought it was fun. I learned a couple things, which is always nice. And yeah. No, but he's going Saturday. He's leaving Saturday, yeah. Yeah. He had been there once also a few months ago when things kind of opened up. And actually, his students are flying on a direct flight from Tel Aviv to Marrakesh or to Casablanca. I forget exactly what. Now there are direct flights, not many, but there are direct flights on Royal Air Morocco that go directly from Tel Aviv to Morocco, which is, again, almost an inconceivable thing. But it's like as soon as we can get there as a congregation, we've got to take that trip because it's a special kind of thing. All right. Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos to our friends on the camera. Good Shabbos to our friends on Zoom. As you can see, I'm alone this Shabbos, so it's just us. So I think I'm going to try something slightly different here, which is you're going to hear, don't worry, maybe most of the melodies, probably all of the familiar melodies, but I might talk a little bit in between, teach a little bit in between, because as our new friend Barry here was just saying, right, even those of us that grew up with, teaching and being taught how to do the prayers, davening as it were, a lot of times the meaning behind it is sort of left as a secondary consideration. So my Friday morning class is really all about this, and there's some things I'll share with us as we go. So before we light and bless our Shabbat candles, which is on page 120, we'll start with just a little quiz, okay? We'll test everybody's knowledge. From what book in the Tanakh do we learn the mitzvah of lighting Shabbat candles? Yeah, any guesses? Any guesses? Anything at all? No wrong answers. This is Jeopardy. You're in serious jeopardy now. And no wrong answers. Batman. All right, it was, where does the commandment to light Shabbat candles come from in our tradition? We'll ask it a different way. It's in the book. Okay, Steve said it's in the book. Very good. Any other thoughts? Anything more specific? Okay, it was a trick question at the beginning. I asked you actually originally what book of the Tanakh it's from, and it's from none of them. Okay, you will not find the commandments. Exactly. This is why you got to watch your rabbi. You never know, right? It is not anywhere in the Torah will you find the commandment that says you should. If anything, actually, you find the opposite. You find the opposite. It's being told what not to do on Shabbat, which is to light candles. But what happens is eventually the rabbis, understanding that, we also need light and heat and ability to cook and things like that before Shabbat, not to mention the fact, right, that, if we don't do these things and you're living in Poland in the winter, you might have some serious life problems. So the rabbis construct actually not just allow for the lighting of a Shabbat candle before Shabbat begins and the usage of that, as a means of enjoying light and all of these things during Shabbat, but they elevate it to the level of a mitzvah, which is why we say asher kichanu mitzvotav. There are different blessings in Hebrew, different formulations. When you get asher kichanu mitzvotav in it, it means that it is a commanded expectation. But again, it doesn't come from anywhere in our Torah, anywhere in the Tanakh at all. It is truly from the Talmud and beyond. So it's part of our Shabbat service, part of Kabbalat Shabbat, is this entire creation of a service that most people, when do you think Kabbalat Shabbat is from? In what time period would you guess? Just throw out anything. What time period do you think Kabbalat Shabbat comes from? Moses, 1600s. Okay, good guesses, very good guesses. Any other thoughts? Bonnie and Ira? Okay, very good. So that will go along with Neil's answer, about 16th century. All right. So the truth is, it's actually a combination of different things. So a lot of it comes from the Kabbalists of Tzfat, 15th, 16th century living in Israel. Some of it, though, comes from much, much earlier, 5th century land of Israel, 8th century Babylonia, all these things combined together. So this whole service that we do and we take for granted originally was constructed really as a warm-up. Kabbalat Shabbat was really just as a warm-up to Ma'ariv. That was the whole intention of it. And it is now, at this point, beyond that. So it's just a fascinating thing when we think about it. All these things that we take for granted. That's one of the great things about teaching this class on Fridays, is it gives me this whole kind of insight coming in, is when we do things like light Shabbat candles, believe it or not, there's a whole history behind that. And it's not accidental, and it has a created and necessary purpose to it. And each one of us that participates in it, right, it's not a simple act. We don't just sit there passively, even though I'm the one lighting the candles and I might be the one doing the blessing and Lauren might be doing the blessing. It's really a reflection, actually, of rabbinic brilliance going back, millennia. So it's important to understand the history. And as we go through the service, I was just saying, since I don't have Lauren and Keelan here tonight, I'm probably going to do a little more talking as we go, might introduce a few things as we go. But with all of that talk, I do wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom, and we will begin with our candle lighting on page 120, and at home you're welcome to join with if you'd like. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Shabbat. Yeah, so again, this is one of those things that I'm sure there is an origin at some point or another, but remembering again, traditionally speaking, the lighting of the Shabbat candles is put it frankly, the responsibility of the women of the household actually, in general. So there is something to be said that my guess is over time, various traditions developed in which, as far as I know, this is one that's become almost universal. I don't think that I've seen Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Sephardic, Ashkenazi, in which this isn't actually the behavior or the action. But that is the main intention, Neil, which is this idea of sort of Kabbalat Shabbat literally means welcoming in Shabbat, bringing it in. So light is symbolic, a lot of different ways in our tradition that we think of it in those ways, and especially in dark times, literally and figuratively, right? We go out of our way to sort of bring that in. And there's lots of things that we do with our body that's part of our ritual, right? Part of our davening experience. In this room in particular, usually the instruction would be to sit as still as you possibly can, right? The pews you're sitting in are designed to keep you sitting basically still. But Judaism sort of has us doing all of these other kinds of things as we pray, standing, sitting, bowing, turning from side to side, doing things with our hands, right? And all of them are evocative, right? They're intentional in the same way that we use our other senses, right? We use our physical body also to make prayer a full body experience, as it were. So good question, Neil. You can throw them out as we go. So we're going to turn to page 130, and just very, very quickly, a reminder that one of the great things about our prayer book, on the left and right-hand sides of the page, you'll see these little sort of indicators of where we are and where we're going. So in the top left in English, you see it says Psalm 95 to 99, and then a comma 29. So this is the first section of our Kabbalat Shabbat service, which is designed, each one of these psalms was associated with a different day of the week and was done by the Levites in the temple. So these were sung out loud, and so this is a way of conceptually, I know Rabbi Morris used to teach this many years ago, conceptually working our way through this past week as we move forward. So we'll do some singing, and we'll do our best without our musical company, but all the more reason why I need your help tonight. So our singers in the room, lend your voice. It'll carry very well, I'm sure. All right, page 130, Psalm 95 at the top of the page. Lechu neranena, lechu neranena, lechu neranena, l'Adonai. Lechu neranena, lechu neranena, lechu neranena, l'Adonai. Naria, naria, letzor yishenu, Nekadma fana vetoda, naria naria letzori shenu, bizmirot naria lo, lechu neranena, lechu neranena, lechu neranena l'Adonai, lechu neranena, lechu neranena, lechu neranena l'Adonai. We're now on page 131, Shiru Ladonai, sort of in the middle of the page in Hebrew. Shiru Ladonai, Shiru Shir Chadash, Shiru Ladonai, Kol Haaretz, Shiru Ladonai, Baruchu Shemo, Basru Meyom Leyom, Yeshuato, Shiru Ladonai, Baruchu Shemo, Basru meyom leyom Yeshuato, Shiru Ladonai, Shiru Shir Chadash, Shiru Ladonai, Kol Haaretz,
Shiru l'Adonai baruch hu shemo, basru meyom leyom yeshuato. Shiru l'Adonai baruch hu shemo, basru meyom leyom yeshuato. We'll turn now to page 132, the last Hebrew paragraph at the bottom of the page, or Zarua. Or Zarua la-tzadik, ule-ishrei lev simecha. Or Zarua la-tzadik, ule-ishrei lev simecha. Simechu tzadikim b'Adonai, v'hodu lezecher kodsho. Simechu tzadikim b'Adonai, v'hodu lezecher kodsho. We'll turn now to page 134. It's the very top of the page, Zamru l'Adonai. Zamru l'Adonai bechinor, bechinor v'kol zimra, b'chatzotrot v'kol shofar. Hariu lifnei hamelech Adonai, Yiram hayam umlo, tevel veyoshveva, neharot imcha uchaf yachat, harim yiranenu, lifnei Adonai kiva, lishpot haaretz, Yishpot tevel betzedek, ve'hamim b'meisharim. Yiram hayam umlo, tevel ve'yoshveva. Neharot imcha uchaf yachad, harim yiranenu. We'll turn to Psalm 99 on page 135, the last Hebrew paragraph in the middle of the page, beginning with Romemu. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ishtachavu lehakodsho. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ishtachavu lehakodsho ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu romemu. Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu romemu. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ishtachavu lehar kodsho. We'll turn now to page 136. Mizmor leDavid, havu l'Adonai b'nei elim, havu l'Adonai kavod va'oz, havu l'Adonai kevod shemo, ishtachavu l'Adonai behadrat kodesh. Kol Adonai al hamayim, el hakavod hirim, Adonai al mayim rabim, Adonai al mayim rabim. Kol Adonai ba'koach, Kol Adonai behadar, Kol Adonai shover harazim, Vaishaber Adonai et arzei halvanon, ויקידם כמו עגל, לבנון וסריון, כמו בן רמים, כמו בן רמים. כל אדוני חוצב להבות אש, כל אדוני יכיל מדבר, יכיל אדוני מדבר קדש, כל אדוני יחולל איילות, ויחשוף יערות ובכלו, כולו מרכבות, כולו מרכבות, כולו מרכבות. אדוני למה בו ישב, וישב אדוני מלך לעולם, אדוני עוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום. Okay, we'll turn to Lechadodi on page 138, and while this is actually in your book, so I'm not telling you anything technically new, a reminder that this is actually a very unique piece of our liturgy. Lechadodi is part of a period of time, comes from part of a period of time in which what are called piyutim, religious poetry, becomes the sort of, the most exciting thing of the time, right? In the same way that in our era, right, if you were to compare, right, we were just talking about with Mimi, right, what may have been familiar 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, is now sort of out of date. That's the same thing that would happen in every generation. There'd be new innovations because, for the most part, right, we like to be excited by new things. So in this particular period of time, you see, especially in medieval Spain, an evolution of medieval poetry into something that really is quite beautiful, but also serves a liturgical purpose. Right? There's lots of beautiful poetry of the time period written by Jews, but it didn't necessarily elevate itself to the point in which we're really talking about, being included in a Siddur and included in what was now used across the Jewish spectrum. So it's unique in one way for its time period, is that it's what's called an acrostic. If you look at the first Hebrew letter of each of the paragraphs, and you add them up, you put them in order, they tell you the name of the person who wrote the piyut. Now this, again, is a rather brilliant innovation of its time, because while we take for granted the idea today that there are copyrights and that generally speaking people are attributed and given credit, although we know that that's something that has not always been the case, right? Especially women who are not given credit for the things that they've written or done. But generally speaking, in our day and age, we have that expectation. It's easy to know who created this particular piece of poetry, this particular prayer. In those days, it wasn't quite so easy. And so this was a brilliant way of basically working in a certain amount of attribution. So the artist and the author would get some recognition for it. But it was also to give it a certain amount of gravitas, and that people knew who Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz, the person whose name is associated with this, they knew who he was, and it gained a certain validity. Beyond that, it also is very important as it relates to Kabbalah, this idea of Kabbalat Shabbat, of going out into the field, so to speak, and welcoming in the presence of the Shabbat bride. It's not Alkabetz who creates the idea. It's a Talmudic idea, but it's a sort of one-off statement from a section of the Talmud that many people were probably not so familiar with. But here he takes it as the basis of literally going out into the fields, right, preparing for Shabbat by greeting Shabbat as if it was a long sought-after bride, right, whatever it might be. So in this, we see again the influence of the Kabbalists of Tzfat, and we also see, something of a liturgical innovation that eventually becomes something that is much more common. And there are various practices, various liturgical pieces that we have that use acrostics to be able to teach us something in addition to. So with all of that information, we'll turn to page 138. We'll do the first, second, fifth, and ninth paragraphs, which is the more common Reform custom, but we'll start at the very top of the page. Lechadodi likrat kala penei Shabbat nekavela. Lechadodi likrat kala penei Shabbat nekavela. Lechadodi likrat kala Penei Shabbat nekabela, lecha dodi likrat kalam. Penei Shabbat nekabela, shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. Ishmianu el hamiuchad, Adonai echad u'shemo echad, l'shemu tiferet v'litila. Lecha dodi likrat kalam, penei Shabbat nekabela, lecha dodi likrat kalam. Penei Shabbat nekabela, likrat Shabbat lechu v'nelcha, ki hi mekor haberacha, meherosh mikedem nesucha, sof maaseh b'machshava tchila. Lecha dodi likrat kalam, Penei Shabbat nekabela, lecha dodi likrat kalam. Penei Shabbat nekabela. Fifth paragraph. Hitoreri, ki ba'orech kumi uri, shir daberi, kevod Adonai alayich nigla. Lecha dodi likrat kalam, penei Shabbat nekabela, lecha dodi likrat kalam, penei Shabbat nekabela. For the ninth and final paragraph, we'll rise and face the entrance to the room, which we walk through, literally welcoming in Shabbat. Bohi beshalom ateret bala, gam besimcha uvetzola, toch emunei aham segula, bohi chala, lecha dodi likrat kalam, penei Shabbat nekabela, lecha dodi likrat kalam, penei Shabbat nekabela. Okay, please be seated. And so, yes. So different parts of Kabbalat Shabbat came from different time periods. So Lecha Dodi and the first few sections, and another thing that we don't traditionally do here that is called Ana Bakoach, which I sing every once in a while just because I love the melody. So those things generally are attributed to 15th century Tzfat, right, as we talked about. The earliest Psalms, the weekday Psalms, are attributed to Babylonia. Babylonia, 8th century. Huh? No, so Spain would be Alcabets and all of those guys who are writing those piyutim. They're influenced by this period of time that begins in Spain. Eventually, Alcabets is in Tzfat. Sorry for confusing. But this idea of writing piyutim, of liturgical poetry, largely actually is influenced by a common practice in the Muslim world. Because remember, at that period of time, Spain was under Muslim control. And so the Jews of that time actually flourished in many cases, most cases. And so at that period of time, there was an interaction between these two sort of cultures in which both in Islam and in Judaism, there was a greater push towards, as I said, a kind of poetic approach to prayer as opposed to things that are more, let's say, systematic or are taken literally. Like, remember, Psalms predate all of this stuff by a long way. Psalms are the earliest kind of ritualized form of prayer that we have. So excellent questions. And this last section here, Psalm 92, this is the oldest part. 92 and 93 are the oldest parts, really, of Kabbalat Shabbat. And these were the Psalms that were associated, again, with the practice in the temple on these appropriate periods of time on Shabbat. So for us, we're going to read from Tzadik Katamar, which is right where the Hebrew indents in the middle of the page on 140. Tzadik Katamar yifrach kerez balvanon yiske shetu bebeit Adonai, bechatzrot Eloheinu yafrichu, od yenuvun veseva. Deshenim verananim ihu lehagid ki ashar Adonai tzuri velo havlata bohu. Saw a hand up in the back. We're a little different tonight because we don't have the cantor and the Keelan with us tonight. So we're just kind of taking it slow and asking questions. So what's your question? Oh, that's an excellent page. Excellent question. We're going to be in a second on page 144. All right, very good. You know, that's one of the great advantages, I think, of the system that they have here. I actually saw the wonderful woman who works here, and she puts these up each week. So they're a little more predictable in that sense. They can tell you exactly what page, but I love that. Good question. Can't do much praying without knowing what page we're on. So page 144 will rise in body or spirit for the Chatzi Kaddish. And again, Chatzi Kaddish is our indication that we've sort of finished one thing and we're about to start something else. So we finished Kabbalat Shabbat and we're about to begin Mari. Yitkadal ve'yitkadash shemei Rabba be'alma divra chirutei ve'amlich malchutei b'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael Ba'agala, ubizman kariv veimeru. Amen. Yehi shmei Rabba mevarach, le'alam li'al me'al maya yitbarach. Yitbarach v'yishtabach, v'yitbar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal, shemei dekudsha b'richu. Leila min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, tamiran v'halma v'yimeru. Amen. Remain standing for the Baruch Hu on page 146. Baruch Hu et Adonai hamevorach. Baruch Adonai Hamorach Leolam Vahem. Please be seated. Let's read together in English on the bottom of page 148. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who speaks the evening into being, skillfully opens the gates, thoughtfully alters the time and changes the seasons, and arranges the stars in their heavenly courses according to plan. You are creator of day and night, rolling light away from darkness and darkness from light, transforming day into night and distinguishing one from the other. Adonai Tzvaot is your name. Ever-living God, may you reign continually over us into eternity. Blessed are you, Adonai, who brings on evening. Umavir yom umevi laila, umavdil beyom uvelaila, Adonai Tzvaot shemo. El chai v'kayam tamid yimloch aleinu leolam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai, Amari Varavim. We'll turn now to page 150, and we'll read together in English in the middle of the page. Everlasting love you offered your people Israel by teaching us Torah and mitzvot, laws and precepts. Therefore, Adonai our God, when we lie down and when we rise up, we will meditate on your laws and your commandments. We will rejoice in your Torah forever. Day and night we will reflect on them, for they are our life, and doing them lengthens our days. Never remove your love from us. Praise to you, Adonai, who loves your people Israel. Ki ehem chayinu ve'orech yameinu, v'ahem nege yomam v'layla, v'avatcha al tasir mimenu li'olamim, baruch atah Adonai, ohev amo Yisrael. Page 152. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Please join me on page 154. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך ובביתך ולכתך בדרך ושוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם להיות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אדוני אלוהיכם אמת. All right, let's read together on page 157 at the very top. Standing on the parted shores of history, we still believe what we were taught before ever we stood at Sinai's foot. That wherever we go, it is eternally Egypt, that there is a better place, a promised land, that the winding way to that promise passes through the wilderness, that there is no way to get from here to there except by joining hands and marching together. As we turn to page 158, Michamocha. Ya bye bye bim 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 bam, ya bye bye bim bam, ya bye bye bim 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 bam, ya bye bye bim bam, ya bye 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 ya bye bim bam, ya bye bye ya bye bim bam. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh, nor hatehilot osefele, nor hatehilot osefele, ya bye bye bim 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 bam, ya bye bye bim bam, ya bye bye bim 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 bam, ya bye bye bim bam. Ya bye 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 ya bye bye bim bam, ya bye 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 ya bye bye bim bam. Malchutecha ra'u vanecha bokeam lifnei Moshe u'Miriam zeli anu ve'amru Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed v'nemar kifad Adonai et Yaakov u'golo mi'ad chazak mimenu Baruch atah Adonai Gal Yisrael. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Adonai, help us to walk with good companions, to live with hope in our hearts and eternity in our thoughts, that we may lie down in peace and rise up, waiting to do your will. We turn to page 160, Hashkivenu at the top of the page. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom v'hamidenu shomreinu lechayim. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom v'hamidenu shomreinu lechayim. Ushmor tzeiteinu, uvoeinu, lechaim u'shalom, me'ata ve'ad olam. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom, ve'hamidenu, Shomereinu lechaim. Blessed are you, Adonai, guardian of Israel, whose shelter of peace is spread over us, over all your people Israel, and over Yerushalayim. We turn now to page 162, Veshameru at the very top of the page. Veshameru b'nei Israel et ha-Shabbat, la'asot et ha-Shabbat, לדורותם ברית עולם. עין עיני ביני ובין בני ישראל, אותי לעולם. כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, וביום השביעי שבת, שבת ויהי נפש. And I invite everyone to rise in body or spirit as we begin the Amidah together on page 164, and then continue silently from there. As always, please go at your own pace, and if you're standing when you're finished, you may be seated. Adonai sefatai titatu fi agi tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. Oseh shalom imromav, uyaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael. Yahaseh shalom, Yahaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. We'll turn now to page 371 for our Mishaberach. In addition to the names I'll read in a moment from our community, we of course continue to extend our prayers to the people of Ukraine and to connect ourselves with them and their plight, and to remember that our prayers of healing may not bring it in the literal sense, but it reminds us and it focuses us on the need to continue to heal and to help. In our community tonight, we are thinking of Debbie Block-Kroll, Gail Gambino, Brad Friedman, Mike Klinghoffer, Chaim Ben Yosef Vachava, Norma Paulsack, Dina Batchana, Benzi Tepper, David Tosher, Jim Cohn, Samuel Moskowitz, Chaim Leib, Joyce Weinberg, Stu Pollack, Jane London, Catherine Guarino, Judy Stern, Miriam Cornfield, Raz Brody, Chana Ruth Batsara, Fagel Tzipora Bat Elisheva Batsara, Richard Gambino, Michelle Sawicki, Adolbasha Bat Yitzchak, Tzvi Menachem and Chaim, Rivka Bat Devora, Amy and Gavin Tucker, Janice Kurz, David Dowling, Israel Ben Yitzchak, Lorraine Danis, Buddy Kosoff, Shelley Newmark, David Kyle Klopman, Rivka Bat Rachel, Sarah Bat Chana, Moshe Eliezer Ben Sivya, Peretz Ben Yehuda, Leah Bat Naomi, Gedalia Ben Leah, Justin Banner, Tzipora Ahava Bat Yehudit Rachel, Jane Beard Cass, Amy Cass, Steve Levine, Ephraim Raphael Ben Esther, Myra Maslin, and Sissy Godinsky. In addition to the names that we mentioned, we'll invite those watching at home or on the Zoom to add names. If there's anyone else in the room who has additional names to share, we'll just start on this side of the room and work towards the back, and this side of the room to the back. And if you have names, just raise a hand so we acknowledge everyone. We'll join together the Mishaberach on page 371 in the middle of the page. Mishaberach Avotenu Mekor HaBracha Lehimotenu. May the source of strength, who blessed the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Mishaberach Imotenu Mekor HaBracha Lavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen. Hey, good Shabbos, everyone. Good Shabbos. Oh, that was a very muted good Shabbos. At least Steve said good Shabbos. I could hear it in the front row. Good Shabbos again. Shabbat shalom. Very good. Thanks, you. Yes. Very much. And apropos, actually, of our conversation last week and our conversation for this evening, Neil asked, for those that couldn't hear it, on whether the addition of Miriam in a prayer such as what we just recited or in other places, whether that is from the original forms of these prayers or whether it's a more contemporary addition. And in most cases, almost every case really, these are more modern additions. But I think that it's important to push back on the idea that there has ever been a singular Siddur, right? That there's only been one Siddur that sprouted forth all the other variations. At some point in history, through various points in history, there are different Siddurim. The oldest one that we have any reference to at all actually is only from the 8th century, from Rav Shvira Gaon, if I remember correctly. And basically all of the things that we consider additions or new things is keeping up actually with a very ancient tradition, which is the constant evolution and change of the prayer book as we as Jews evolve and change. And also to add the fact that, Jews, again, in Morocco, as we were just talking about, would not have been the same as Jews who were living, for example, in Ukraine, right, or Poland or in Lithuania. Many, many, many similar things about practices, but many things that are quite different. And so to this day, there are things that are changing all the time. And again, as we were talking about last week, this being Women's History Month, we talked about the Jewish Women's Archive. We all remember, right? Hopefully you checked it out, like I told you to last week, but about Regina Jonas, who was the first female rabbi who was ordained in Germany, who we really knew nothing about. I knew nothing about until doing the research. And then as it happens, this Shabbat is the 100th anniversary of the first bat mitzvah that took place in America, and in reality was probably the first thing that we could really refer to outwardly as a bat mitzvah. How many of you knew that that was happening? So I did know about it, but I was reminded of it. Actually, there was an NPR piece on All Things Considered, so if you hear it on your way home tonight, or you can look it up, it was really very well done, and quotes extensively one of my favorite teachers, one of my favorite people, Rabbi Carol Balin, who is a professor at HUC, and I think also is at NYU sometimes, right? I don't know. But she is one of the foremost experts at this point in time in American Jewish history in particular. And she's writing a book now on the history of bat mitzvah in this country and how it developed. So the fact that I said that was already surprising to all of us. We're going to learn some interesting things tonight. And so who was the first bat mitzvah? Any wild out there guesses of who we might think it might have been? Okay, let's try for era. What decade do we think it began? What do you think? Very good. So he's paying attention. 100 years. So what year would be the year in which it happened? Very close. 1922. But you're right on the money. Okay. Somebody in the room is paying attention, people. This is very good. You're already 2 for 2 tonight. Excellent. Okay. So 1922. So just again, if we're thinking about our general history, what happens in 1920 that's sort of significant to the world of women in this country in particular? Right to vote, okay? And of course, the right to vote is the end of already an initial period of very significant gains that were pushed for in all sorts of things we talked about not so long ago, in unionizing and the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire Factory fire. All of these kinds of things are all happening in the same kind of time period. So 1922 is really on the cusp of all of this. And who is this first bat mitzvah? none other than Judith Kaplan, daughter of the famed Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan. So how many of you, just by a show of hands, have heard the name Mordechai Kaplan before? Okay, so that's good. So if I pushed a little further to more details about him, we might struggle a little bit, but he is considered to be the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, which is actually the first unique American Judaism, right? Reform Judaism came over from Germany, Orthodox Judaism came over from everywhere. Conservative Judaism broke off from Reform Judaism, so it's not exactly its own thing. Reconstructionist Judaism, in the same kind of way, broke off from Conservative Judaism, but really created something actually quite unique and distinct. And I'm not going to attempt to define Reconstructionist Judaism for you. To be honest with you, they struggle with it to some degree, to the point in which actually I think they've changed the name officially, right? It's Reconstructing Judaism, I believe, to put it in the active instead of in the passive. And because part of the concept that Kaplan had was that Judaism is a ever-evolving civilization. That's his 1,000-page book on Judaism and Jewish history. It's a remarkable, book and deep in many ways, but also is sort of, he has my tendency for run-on sentences, so it's a little hard to study him sometimes. But he, of course, was at the forefront of what we would call experimental forms of Judaism, certainly in this country. And so his daughter, Judith, the eldest of his children, was decided to be this first bat mitzvah. And Rabbi Balin quotes in this piece from the NPR, he always joked that he initiated the rite for 4 reasons. Judith being the first, and his younger daughters being the second, third, and fourth. Okay? So he did it largely because of a personal drive, but the truth is that when we study this and we look at it, the bat mitzvah of Judith Kaplan is nothing resembling, for example, the bat mitzvah of the young women who come up to the bima in our congregation, or the bat mitzvah of pretty much most young Jewish women who come up to the bima in their congregations. Insofar as when she was called up, so to speak, to the Torah, she was not actually allowed to read from the Torah itself. On top of it, when she came up, she didn't even really come all the way up to the bima. She spoke from lower down of the bima. And she didn't speak again as part of the Torah service, but only after her father had given the drash, and then she spoke. So this beginnings in 1922 obviously was not the end point, but it was a still remarkable beginning, and one that started at SAJ, the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, which is still located to this day on 86th Street. Exactly. I grew up 4 blocks from there. I grew up going there many times. That's where you went. There you go. So Barry says he used to go. Question. Say that one more time. So as far as I can tell, she's the only one that takes place at that moment, but it starts off something. And as it turns out that a lot of, as you can imagine, the original push for this was rabbis whose children, right, daughters in particular, the rabbis wanted their daughters to have some opportunity to acknowledge this shift that was taking place. So before I go into a little bit more detail about this, I think it's important to acknowledge a little bit of the history of what a bar mitzvah is so that we can understand what distinguishes it and why we sometimes put an assumption on this particular ritual and think that it's older than it is and think that it is more uniformly followed than it actually is. Just out of curiosity, how many of you, where do you think bar mitzvahs come from in our history? How long ago have we been doing them from? What do you think? 3,000 years ago. Okay, so what 3,000 years ago basically is sort of, divided monarchy, right? The Jews are settled in the land of Israel. They're pretty established. There's a temple there. All those things are going on. Okay, good guess. Anybody think older than that? Okay, anybody think more recently? So the truth is it's somewhere in between. It's really actually not until about the 13th century in France where you start to even see mentions of this being a thing. Okay, like being an actual event itself. The concept, just so we're clear, bar mitzvah and its later creation of the bat mitzvah, these are really legal terms. They basically describe in Jewish law, in halakha, when a child ceases to be a child, a minor, and becomes what in legal terms is a major, right? They become responsible for their own behavior. So up until that point, traditionally it's understood that the parents are responsible for the behavior of the child, vis-a-vis Jewish practice, halakha, and things like that. So if a child violates one of the commandments, it's not their fault, it's the fault of the parent. So before you even have something called a bar mitzvah, you have a blessing that has questionable origins, but we understand has actually been used for quite some time. It's called the Petarani Prayer. It basically says, it's supposed to be done by a parent after the child has their bar mitzvah, and it basically says, I'm no longer responsible. Dear God, I'm no longer responsible, right? And this was it. And that was basically the entirety of this experience. So the idea of the bar mitzvah as this big, gigantic rite of passage that's existed since Moses is a complete, fiction. It comes from a particular period of time, and usually once we hear about it, there's a good chance it existed prior to that, and we just don't have records. But by and large, it was not the experience that we picture in our minds. So this idea of bar mitzvahs as being this big, gigantic thing forever, and that bat mitzvahs not existing, right, it was a relationship to that, it simply, in their world, would have made no sense, because the main idea of a bar mitzvah that was celebrated was the idea that they were then old enough, presumably, to be able to read from the Torah, to be able to teach Torah, and in particular to put tefillin on, to put on phylacteries. So, of course, these are the things that over time develop and develop and develop until the point when they become big events, and they become, big fancy meals and things like that. And there's plenty of evidence, especially throughout, Ashkenaz lands. And the Sephardim develop an entirely different system, and they generally actually celebrate it before 13, from 12. So, again, this idea that there is a uniformity of any of this is already something of a fiction. But nonetheless, by the time that you get to 1922, it is not a fiction. Okay? Every young Jewish girl who is growing up in this country or anywhere in the world is aware of the fact that boys get to do this big thing and they don't have an equivalency. Not only that boys are allowed to engage fully in the Torah, in teaching of Torah, in leading of services, and serving in the temple in various ways and becoming rabbis, and that in the end, they can observe and see that they are being treated essentially as second-class citizens, that they are not given the same opportunities. So while we can acknowledge that in 1922, Kaplan's experience was far from what we would hope for our own children today, in its era, it was a radical shift, right? A radical shift, one that actually drew a considerable amount, as you can imagine, of vitriol from colleagues of his who were on the more traditional side, and even from those just in his general orbit, right? Don't think for a second that the reform movement or the conservative movement jumped on this immediately and all of a sudden it started to work. It actually took decades, and it took the work of the young women in particular who kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And beyond that, women in the communities themselves getting on boards of the synagogues, right? Being able to change policies from within. And while it didn't change overnight, by the time that you get to the 60s, you start to see it becoming much more common practice that in, I would say, a plurality of conservative synagogues and reform synagogues, it starts to become a norm. But again, it's normative practice at the beginning. The girls are usually given a bat mitzvah on a Friday night when Torah is not read, or on a late Saturday evening for Havdalah, in which, again, Torah is not read. So it takes, again, a tremendous amount of pushing from within in order for there to be this significant kind of change. And it's not that there is any one point in history in which all of a sudden it happens, but there is sort of, as I said, especially in the later 50s and in the 60s, some radical shifts that start to take place. And one of the most gratifying things I've been a part of since I've been here at the temple has been several adult bat mitzvah for women who didn't have the opportunity when they were younger to be able to do in later years what they couldn't have done before. And it was a rather powerful experience because, again, as a young Jewish boy, this was, an assumption that there was nothing unusual about the fact, right? I was going to have this experience. But for, my parents who, again, were really children in many ways of the 60s and of the 70s and of the, the periods of time in which they were particularly aware and motivated to make change. For our family, for me, for my sister, for my brother, right, there was never any suggestion that there was a primacy of the boys over the girls. There was never any suggestion that my brother and me were going to be treated any differently than my sister, including at her bat mitzvah or our bar mitzvahs. But again, as a kid growing up in the 80s and the 90s, it all seemed normal to me. I didn't really think about what that actually meant and what was actually involved in it. And I think I actually got a text response from my mom because I realized, as I'm sitting here thinking about this, I never asked her, what was her bat mitzvah experience was like. So I'll read it. Hope she'll forgive me for, saying it out loud, but that hers was on a Friday night. Hers was on a Friday night. It wasn't the same kind of experience. Bonnie, you got... Interesting. So they taught you how to read Torah, but then didn't allow you to read Torah. A lot of things going on, but you were in that fulcrum moment, right? That's in the era in which, again, these things are starting to really change. Yeah. So, again, and I know that not everybody on the Zoom can't necessarily hear, the discussion in the room, but basically, several of our people are talking about what was the experience like for you. And I think that the reality is that for many people in our congregation, they either never had the opportunity, or if they had the opportunity, it was in effect something different than what their, contemporary boys were having of the same time period. So I don't bring this up actually as a negative. Barry, you have something you want to add? So the reality is in the Torah, right? Without a doubt. So Barry brings to, right, this is a much deeper kind of question, right? It's a much deeper kind of investigation, which is sort of where the origins of these bifurcation of the genders and different expectations really, and there's no single point. But certainly in the Torah, there are many examples in which men and women are treated differently, one of which is really actually interesting in this conversation, right? We pick the year 13, right? 13 or 12 for a girl, largely based on biological concerns. But in the Torah, their main consideration of the shift for a boy, for example, to a man in terms of obligation is actually at 20 years old. It's when they're able to be considered as part of the army and they pay taxes. But up until that point, the 13-year-old thing is not mentioned anywhere in the Torah, not in a single place. But there are many examples in which women are held to different kinds of standards, in which they're prohibited from doing certain kinds of things. But remember, again, the whole concept of reading from the Torah publicly is not generally part of the Torah itself. There's only one part of the Torah that talks about reading it out loud in a public setting, and it's nothing like what we're familiar with today. So again, all of this really comes down to the idea that, our prayer and our prayer experience is created by us. It's a fiction to suggest that there is some text, some original version in which everything is one way and everything else is wrong. It's actually, if you study the history of Jewish prayer, you'll see all of these kinds of innovations over time. And this is one that is not about necessarily the prayers themselves, although that's changing to some degree as well, right? With changes in sort of gender identity and how to approach things that are not necessarily a bar or a bat mitzvah and how to refer to them. All these changes are taking place, but they're all grown out of the same kind of idea, which is that Judaism is not intended to be static, right? If there's one thing about Kaplan's ideology that makes a lot of sense is the idea that we're on a sort of a ever-flowing evolution of sorts, and that each community has to decide what its values are and where it's going to place its values. So I want to leave this conversation for now and invite you all, again, there is a wealth of information, including on the Jewish Women's Archive, which I talked about last week, of this anniversary of the story of Judith Kaplan and others. But this is a blessing that was created by Rabbi Lauren Grabel Herman, who's a friend of mine and happens to be the rabbi currently of the SAJ, of the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, which is Kaplan's congregation. And she wrote this blessing on the 100th anniversary, which I thought was lovely and I wanted to share with you. So she says, on the 100th anniversary of the first bat mitzvah, we are grateful for those brave women in our congregation and beyond who initiated bat mitzvah in communities across North America for generations to come. We honor you today and celebrate your chutzpah and commitment, and your willingness, like Judith Kaplan, to step forward as a bat mitzvah when there were no others in front of you to lead the way. May you be blessed with satisfaction as you see young girls, women, and people of all genders walk the path that you helped forge and take their place in Jewish life. May you find continued success in all your labors and be granted health and joy along with all your sisters amongst the people of Israel and the world. And we say it together, Amen. So with that blessing to all the pioneers and to those in our community who have been pioneers, we thank and we bless you and we celebrate this 100th anniversary. And we are really grateful, again, for the courage that it took to take these first steps. And while it may pain us that it took this long and that we are still really fighting for a lot of that sense of equality within Judaism, I think there are some things to really be grateful for and to really celebrate on the Shabbat. And Lord knows we could use some of that. So last question to our friend in the back. No kidding. So next time you come back, please try to find out the name. So this must very well likely be. I mean, this has to probably be exactly that. Wow, that's pretty wild. Who would have thought that was going to happen tonight? We make all these connections. Okay, next time you come, we'll finish the circle, right? Make sure that we know all this. That's just phenomenal. Okay, so we're going to turn now to page 586, and we'll rise in body or spirit, Aleinu l'shabech, at the very bottom of the page.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגור עלינו ככל המונם. ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד. I invite those in mourning and those observing yahrzeit to please remain standing. Everyone else may be seated at this time. We think of those who've passed in our community in recent months. Dr. John Abdrakin, Faith Diskin, Linda Denath, Arlene Eber, Jay Fagan, Ellen Frank, Evelyn Gelb, Chaim Bear Greenwald, Arthur Grossman, Gerald Hirsch, Mark Joseph, Gertrude Katz, Deirdre Klein, Leo Leibowitz, William Lippman, Audrey Lubo, Morty Lynn, Jerry Monroe, Nancy Nagel, Harry Olstein, Geraldine Rosen, Harriet Roth, Jeannie Rubin, Howard Schreier, David Senf, Marlene Silverberg, Blanche Sklar, Rita Sandra Snyder, Joan Strung Tengzilius, and Matthew Adam Zimmerman. We also mark the yahrzeits that occurred during the last week for Leonard Barron, Murray Bergman, Sally Burke, Arlene Eber, Herman Epstein, Harry Fleischer, Lieb Goldstein, Isidore Harkaveh, M.L. Hart, Don Katz, Louis Leonard, Rita Margaretin, Pearl Meyerson, Joseph Moskowitz, Kiki Riskin, Henrietta Samborn, Gussie Schenker, Geraldine Scholl, Marzi Taylor, Michael Warner, Carol Wechter, and Arthur Weiss. Does anyone else have a name of someone for whom you're saying Kaddish that you'd like to share? In solidarity with the loved ones, our friends who are remembering their loved ones, we rise as the mourners join me on page 598, Mourners Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, be'alma divra chirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, v'agalav v'zman kariv v'yimru amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah mevarach le'alam u'le'almei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shemei d'kudsha b'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechamata, ta'amiran be'alma v'yimru amen. Yehei shalama Rabbah min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav, hu yaseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Zichronam livracha, may every one of their memories be for a blessing. Okay, please be seated. And Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So it's not custom to eulogize on Shabbat, so I won't do that. But I will say, as we just read our Kaddish list earlier today, we said goodbye to Gert Katz. And for those of you that maybe don't know, our community, Gert and Don were very significant parts of really building and keeping Temple Adas Israel alive during particularly lean years, and also really very, very involved here in Sag Harbor and connected to the Sag Harbor community. So Gert was really just a remarkable person, a dear friend, and somebody who I really looked up to. So, it's hard to say goodbye, but she's somebody that really should give us all a lot of pride in our temple. And what, again, some synagogues exist and they're plopped down in a place and they have almost no connection to the place around it. They come up because the community exists around it, and it's sort of bifurcated. Our temple really is largely deeply connected to Sag Harbor Village because of people, and especially because of the earliest people in this community who really laid a foundation for future generations, future rabbis to really take up. So we love Gert, and we will miss her terribly. And if you get a chance, drop a line to her family. It's a tough loss.
On a happier note, we'll make a few announcements. The first, please join us for Shabbat services on Zoom tomorrow morning at 9:30. Torah study will begin a little bit later at 12 o'clock, again open to all. On Monday, my Heschel class is at 12 o'clock. Nina Mitzvah will be meeting, earlier in the morning at 9. Barry will get you set up for this week so you can join us. Again, that's Monday at 12 o'clock for my class. Hebrew School is at 3:30. Social Justice Committee has its regular meeting at 5, and the Musar Practice Group at 7 o'clock. On Wednesday, Hebrew School begins at 3:30. And on Thursday, we are welcoming our friends back our friends from Film Shul at 7 o'clock, again this Thursday, to talk about some of the great female minds in comedy here in this country and really around the world. So again, that is 7 o'clock. It's welcome to all. Just make sure that you sign up on Eventbrite. My Friday class, again, if you enjoyed any of the tidbits of learning that we did throughout the service, it's a great opportunity on Friday mornings. You can join us at any time. And even if you just want the videos and you can't show up to the class, that's also fine. You can just let me know and I'll be happy to send them to you each week. On Sunday, March 27th, we also just want to highlight the virtual program of the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History titled Courageous Choices. So again, that'll be a virtual tour Sunday, March 27th at 7 o'clock. And to round out the month, on March 31st, we have a book talk with educator Sandra Dubin on Barry Weiss's book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism. Again, that's March 31st. You should be getting pretty soon the April calendar and all the stuff about Pesach that's coming up. I hope that you had a Zissen Purim, a fun and enjoyable Purim, and then we'll have a Zissen Pesach, a fun and enjoyable Pesach to come. And again, just a reminder that there's a lot of great resources to continue your studies, especially on topics of women in Judaism. For those that remember my High Holiday sermon from this year, this is something that's really been on my mind a lot, and trying to take these opportunities to share stories that we have not shared, to learn things we've not learned, and to push ourselves a little bit further and to realize that while we can certainly pat ourselves on the back of some achievements, we still have a long way to go in a lot of regards, and we don't give up on that pursuit. And we really celebrate again and honor the heroes that have led the way. So with all of that, I'm going to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. I think we'll do Shalom Aleichem, since it's just us, before we do Kiddush. So it's up to you. If you choose, you're welcome to rise. If you came with somebody you know, you can put an arm around them if you'd like. Page 627. Again, page 627, Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem, Malachei HaSharet, Malachei Elyon. Mi melech malchei hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Boachem leshalom, malachei hashalom, malachei elyon. Mi melech malchei hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Baruchuni leshalom, malachei hashalom, malachei elyon. Mi melech malchei hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Tzedchem leshalom, malachei hashalom, malachei elyon. Mi melech malchei hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We'll turn now to page 123 for Kiddush. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu mitzvotav v'ratzavanu, v'shabbat kodsho b'ahava u'b'ratzon inchilanu, zikaron lemahaseh v'reishit, ihu yom techila lemikrae kodesh, zecher litziat Mitzrayim, kivanu v'acharta, ve'otanu kidashta, mikol hamim, ve'shabbat kodshecha, ve'ahava u'ratzon inchaltanu. Baruch atah Adonai mekadesh HaShabbat. Amen. L'chaim. Good Shabbos, everybody. go out there, go learn some things, get home safely. Twilight hour is a little on the dangerous side. You got to be careful. The deer, this is their time to jump out. So be careful. You guys especially on the way home. The deer like that road. I know. Where you guys are, it's very deerified. All right, Barry. No, don't worry. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to email you. URA actually did exactly what you're supposed to do. I just have to, I do, and I just have to click a button that says OK, and then you'll get. Yeah, no, for sure. Right, I know. It's pretty.